My biggest position, incidentally, is I have Aston Martin, Apache, which is an oil company, and Greggs, which makes sausage rolls. So, in case anyone's wondering whether my very
delicious sausage rolls,
yes, delicious sausage. Hello and welcome to another telecoms.com podcast. It is the last podcast of January. Now, Ian...
I'm glad you're opening on this note.
Yeah. Now, Ian, you've been on dry January, haven't you? We can tell that you've just lost all your morale. You can't be bothered to shave anymore. And of course, the 1st of February is a Monday. Now, I don't think you should get on it on a Monday. So are you gonna break your dry January now?
I think so. I mean, it's the 29th. You know, it's been 4 weeks, so okay. I'm not that bothered about bursting across a kind of 31st of January finish.
When I've done dry January, which I didn't this year, I've always I've never made it till the 31st.
Yeah, I know I could make it to the 31st, but as we're on a call and
I could have done dry January. I don't have to prove anything to anyone.
So yeah, let's crack into a beer.
What have you got? What's the fridge got?
Well, I got a Guinness because I made a Guinness and ale pie.
I see. Because I didn't think you were a Guinness drinker.
No, but I do quite a good pie that's got, well, you put the Guinness in it, obviously the alcohol burns off, but it creates a really nice sauce.
But that's all you got to drink.
And so that's all I've got to drink. But I do like Guinness, so I'm not complaining.
Good.
I don't drink it very much, but it's tasty.
It is tasty.
Are you opening? What are you on?
Yeah. I've got the star up. Has it gone everywhere?
No. Saved it.
All right, I'll wait till you've poured. You got to let it settle, though, haven't you? We'll be halfway through the pod before that's ready to drink.
No, it should be all right.
Anyway, so are you ready to rock?
Yeah,
cheers, mate. Look,
cheers.
Clink.
And as you drink, I will fill the blank with the city of the month, which is, drumroll, Columbus, Ohio, city of Steven Spielberg. Yeah.
Right. Sort of center of Rust Belt, America.
Yeah, and then followed closely by Sofia, Bulgaria. Deserves a, good try. That's it.
God knows. It's completely random, isn't it? You just talk shit for an hour and see who wants to listen. That's kind of podcasting in a nutshell, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so what are we going to talk shit about this week? Assisted now by some much-needed lubrication.
Yeah, I feel totally hammered now. I'm going to have to go and lie down.
I know, by the end of it, you're just going to be picking fights with the webcam. I think we should start. We both wrote about Ericsson's quarterlies today, so we can have a little chat about Ericsson's fortunes. And also earlier on in the week, they had a product announcement, which they at least seemed to think was a big deal, around network slicing. So we can talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we should chat. You, after your Ericsson call today, you had a call with Rakuten. I know we've chatted about them a fair bit, but it sounds like this call, while it was set up with loads of hacks and analysts, seemed to be set up, at least in part, to sort of admonish light reading for some of its coverage. So I think that's quite funny.
Yeah.
And if you're getting their attention that much, then you must be doing something right. So let's have a little chat about that. Then we're going to finish. I mean, I found a tenuous excuse for writing about all the Wall Street short selling Reddit craziness this week, because Nokia made an announcement, and that ended up being our most read story, like about 10 times more than any other story. Now, I know it's kind of cheating, because I imagine most of the people who clicked on it were just people who'd Googled. I mean, I checked out that telecoms.com was top of Google News for Nokia. So I think people were just wondering what's going on, saw my story and clicked on it. But, I'll take the clicks. It all counts. And so I think we'll finish off having a slightly self-indulgent chat about that, just because it's a fascinating topic and a very current thing. Okay. And just to remind you that if you're watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, you can also listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other podcasting platforms. Actually, before we get into Ericsson, before I forget, I just want to recap on some fun sparring with my audience that I've had this week. So you guys will know, and the audience will know, I make no secret of my general hostility towards the European Union as a bureaucracy and a political thing, as opposed to Europe, where I very much like going to France, Spain, and Italy, and wherever else whenever I get the chance. And it just cracks me up because whenever I put a little dig into a story, there's always people who rise to it. So there was a fairly dry story about how our government was having a look at laws governing access to telecoms infrastructure. So, the laws, when you've got a mast on some farmer's land, does the farmer get to hold you to ransom, or are they obliged to let you go and install your new kit and all that sort of thing? And it just occurred to me that this review is happening less than a month after we officially left Europe bureaucratically. So I headed up saying, now that we're free of EU regulation, it's time to make the Electronics Communication Code fit for purpose. And I followed up by saying, credit where it's due to the UK government for getting on with this less than a month after it shook off Europe's regulatory shackles. And I had a bunch of people going, what exactly do you mean by regulatory shackles? And can you please tell us which specific thing, and all this sort of stuff. I wasn't talking about a specific thing. I was just talking about us now being free to make our own rules, which to me was the fundamental point of the whole thing. And so, someone goes, so can you tell us what Ofcom's doing now that's so different? I just said they're doing what they want. That's the point. It's not what they're doing. It's the fact that they get to choose to do it. Some other person said that I'm very biased against the EU, the very thought. And so I challenged him to substantiate. And some guy wrote 3 paragraphs on what a rubbish journalist I am and how I should just accept criticism unconditionally and raise my game because some guy had a pop at me on the forums. And he said one paragraph, he went, Scott, maybe you should try a little bit of introspection. People are coming to your article with criticisms and concerns about the quality of writing information and impartiality, and firing back demands for further information is not a valid response. So I just write, yes, it is. Because, I just don't... the thing I don't get, the reason I bring it up, other than I think it's quite amusing, is I don't get what people want. I mean, have a pop on the forums. I won't ever censor someone for having a pop at me. But just because one person thinks what I wrote was shite, I'm not under any obligation to explain myself or change my writing or show contrition. So that's quite funny. You don't have this fun because you don't have the forums open on Light Reading, do you, Ian?
No, they're disabled. Yeah, someone did write in recently. Actually, I think one of our freelancers, Ken Wheeland, wrote a really good story actually about health concerns to do with 5G. Apparently, some Edinburgh University professor had come out and said,
"Yes, I saw that."
Sort of nothing to do with coronavirus. It was a really well researched piece by Ken. Actually, he'd gone to the trouble of actually talking to a few people. She often don't have time to do that much of these days, but he'd been quite thorough. And someone wrote in and said, obviously someone who knew what they were talking about, complaining they couldn't comment on the website. Why is it closed? But we've got problems with spam basically that need resolving before it can be opened, and it's been a long running thing. But
well, hopefully
it's unfortunate because it just looks like there's a lot of uncommented on stories, and it's
it looks like no one reads your stuff.
exactly,
which we know not to be the case.
And it's just you can't do it on any of them basically. So
no. Well, but then again, as we're going to come to in a bit, some people, while they can't comment on your story, will host entire press conferences in order to comment on your story.
Yeah, well, maybe that's a bit flattery, but yeah, I think they were. There was clearly
some with it.
Motivation from something Mike wrote.
Right. Okay. Well, I'll go with that. Journalist embellishes story to make it seem like a bigger deal. Shock. It's the other thing people don't understand. Sometimes you get accused of writing clickbait headlines. No, it's just headlines. Of course, we slightly sensationalise, but as long as the body copy can support the headline, that's just normal journalistic practice.
Yeah.
Anyway, what can you do? So Ericsson. All right, I've banged on for a bit. So why don't I hand the ball to you? Why don't you tell us what you found out about Ericsson today?
Yeah, well, they've reported on their full year results, and they're really good actually. I mean, I don't think it's a big surprise. Their recovery's been underway for some time now. Had a good first 9 months of last year, despite all the difficulties with the pandemic and everything. And they've been going on about growing market share in certain regions at other companies' expense. So that seemed to continue in the fourth quarter. And lo and behold, they're kind of way ahead of the targets they set. So, I mean, that's really encouraged. Yeah. They were talking about 12%, which seemed, I think they might even be talking about 10% at one stage, actually, this year. And they're up to 12%, which was what they wanted to get to as a minimum by 2022. So they're sort of 2 years ahead of that. And, even that sort of 10% margin target seemed quite optimistic, I think, when Ecom took over in early 2017. Now it's come at a huge cost. You look back to their Capital Markets Day last year when they were pretty frank about how many staff they laid off, 25,000.
25K.
25,000. Wow. Now I think they've because they've hired other people, the actual net reduction is not that big, but they've basically had to let 25,000 people go, which is huge. And a lot of that's divestment activity. They've sold some underperforming units. They're much more focused now on network, and that business is really competitive. I mean, credit to them. They're up there. There was question marks, I think, over them in the 4G era, whether they really had it anymore. And you saw Huawei coming along and overtaking them to be the kind of big equipment supplier in Europe. And they've got their mojo back, I think, really in that market. Sales are up, and it all looks good. But I mean, one of the things I took away from it was, because you always want to sort of draw out the challenges, I guess, and the questions as a journalist, was this big sort of issue about China, and they did it themselves. Really, they invited that because they're right in the introduction where Ecom has his the CEO Ecom has his little sort of speech, not speech, but his write up, his take on how they've done. He immediately sort of drew attention to this geopolitical situation that's been going on, and there's been quite a lot of coverage recently. Even I think The Economist wrote about it in the edition that's just out. This sort of Sweden-China spat that's developed, where the Swedish government has basically told operators that 5G spectrum, they can't use Huawei to build the networks. And there was a challenge by Huawei, but it's basically worked out that companies have now got spectrum, and they're already landing signing agreements with Nokia and Ericsson. And it's all a bit awkward for Ericsson because it's got this fairly significant business in China that's been responsible for much of the growth they've seen. I think if you look at a breakdown of the results, that's where that's the double-digit growth has all come in China.
Oh, it's 30-odd% from Northeast Asia.
Exactly, and that's the real worry for them.
They tried to deflect a little bit by going, there's been a bit from Japan, and we both you were just before me. We both chatted to Fredrik Jedling, the head of their networks division, effectively the number 2 in the company, isn't he? And I was going, so can you give us a split between China and Japan? He wouldn't.
Well, they do have that, though. You can find that, Scott, in the report. They have a percentage.
Really? How come he wouldn't tell me it then?
Weird, because they haven't got a breakdown of network sales, but overall sales, which would include digital and managed services as well. They have a percentage for their biggest markets. So China it doesn't give the number, but it says 9% of total revenues. So you can work it out. It's 18.6 billion Swedish krona, which is $2.2 billion. That's up. That's grown by 17%.
But does it break out Japan?
No, well, I don't think Japan. It only breaks out the top 5 markets, and I don't.
Maybe that's why he wouldn't. Because I was sort of kind of explicit. I was just asking for some kind of split because they're going Northeast Asia, which normally means China, and then they made a point of going Japan's done all right, and I felt that was them trying to sort of damp down how reliant on China they've been.
It has done well. I mean, they've done. I think Japan and South Korea have been really strong markets for them as well last year. So it's not all China, but it's a massive market. This is the thing: 17% in a market that's this year made 2.2 billion is a lot of growth, and and the interesting thing is their share of that market is still pretty small. I mean, they keep going on about how they've grown their position in 5G. It's much bigger than it was in. But it's tiny. It's still less than 12% of the market that they've got, and the rest of it's Huawei and ZTE basically. But in a market where the operators have built 700, reports are saying 700,000 5G base stations last year. It's ridiculous. It's a number that's like not. You can't compare it with any other country in the world, really.
Not even the US. No, it's just
certainly not the US. They're nowhere near on sort of densification. I mean, all right, there are far fewer people in the US than there are in China. That's one way of looking at it. But if you look at it in sort of geographical area, then China's just sort of peppered with base stations, basically, and it's really good business for Ericsson. So it doesn't want to lose this. If it loses this, it's problematic.
Exactly, and Ekholm actually. So I got a little comment out of Yedling, and then I was looking at your piece because I for some reason hadn't read all of. I think I just read the bit. Ekholm has quite a long prepared statement. It's like about 10 paragraphs, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I just got to the bit I wanted and didn't read the rest. But I saw from your piece that he'd made a comment on the China thing. So I got Yedling to say it may cause that. So just to recap, by the way, before we skip over it, well, you did just touch on it, but the fact that Sweden banned Chinese vendors has obviously got Ericsson shitting itself about China returning the favour and banning Swedish vendors, i.e. Ericsson, in China, which in a tit-for-tat way, you couldn't really blame her for doing it. They're like, okay, two can play that game, isn't it? Yeah. But they haven't yet. And so you and I obviously asked about it. And Yedling said they may cause some repercussions. And Ekholm, in his prepared statement, actually addressed that head on and said, it might all go big tongue.
Yeah. And it's partly... I mean, there's other things kind of going on in China. I think it's worth pointing out. There's this sort of licensing dispute that's been boiling now for a couple of years. I think it was 2019. This all kicked off, where they've sort of been accused of patent abuses in that market, which is a further pressure point for them, because we've seen with this dispute they've got going on with Samsung that can come at a cost. I mean, they've already said this is going to wipe about up to 1.5 billion Swedish kroner off operating income for the next few quarters, and it's very uncertain when it might get resolved. So it's not. I think it's just the sales side of it. There's other things that could happen. There's a kind of supply issue. One of the concerns that was brought out in the earnings call was standards fragmentation, which we talk about a lot. Industry bifurcation and later 5G standards and 6G perhaps being regionalised. It's very interesting him addressing that head on. I mean, there is a concern it could happen, however small it might be. And
what did he say?
It's really not in a. I got his quote written down somewhere. I've got my story open, but he said, I mean, it's sort of what you'd expect. But from an industry point of view, it is critical we hold together the global standard, because it has allowed the world to connect 8 billion subscribers. I mean, they've done very, very well, the big equipment makers, out of economies of scale and all this sort of stuff, and it really works.
And they're right. And actually,
model
it occurs to me that when I'm chatting to Fredrik Yedling, he, when you compare the comments you got from him with Ekholm's comments, they're almost identical. So they've got their talking points, and they're really disciplined with their messaging. And while it's great to speak to him, I even said to him, I don't know if you ever listened to the podcast, and he sort of seemed to make a noise that indicated he was at least aware of it.
I'm sure some Ericsson people do.
Yeah, so this isn't a dig, Fredrik, if you're listening to this one, but the message discipline's so tight that you almost wonder why they bother to do individual interviews when they're just going to more or less echo what has already been said. But there we go. It's still great to chat to him.
It is. I think one of the interesting things is that, because analysts will be looking at this obviously and wondering what a China ban would mean if it happened for targets, and the fact that they've had this really good year and the margins are really healthy and they've got lots of cash in their books. One of the messages that came out today on the call and in the report was they've kind of basically completed their turnaround. The last few years they've been trying to get the business back into shape and not have to worry about layoffs and, areas that are not that competitive. Okay, that's arguably still going on in digital to some extent and maybe managed services, but they're much smaller units anyway. And they can start to think about growth, and investment and areas to go into, and enterprise is a big part of that. So if China all of a sudden becomes an issue and they lose access to that market, you kind of sense it could be a bit of a setback for them strategically,
just a bit,
in terms of what they can achieve.
I think it'd be huge.
And the sort of things they want to do. And I think, you can look at it on the other hand, there's a lot they can pick up at the expense of Chinese equipment vendors in other parts of the world. They acknowledged today, I think for the first time, they've always downplayed this when they talk about taking market share, it's always non-Chinese rivals, which is basically a reference to Nokia. But it was interesting today in the earnings call that they acknowledged for the first time that they've basically won work off Huawei. And they couldn't really avoid saying that because
Europe?
Of what's happened. Yeah, it's all going to be in Europe because obviously they're not present in the US anyway, and they're certainly not winning work at Huawei's expense in China. African markets, I think, I don't know, it's harder to say, isn't it? Maybe sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. But Europe, clearly, there are very clear examples that both of us have written about. We just talked about Sweden. That's one where Net for Mobility, this joint venture between Telenor and Tele2, I think, is switched immediately from Huawei to Ericsson and Nokia. We've got the swap outs that are going on in the UK, with BT and Three, and I think there are other instances as well that I can't remember off the top of my head. There's some Scandinavian ones.
How much of you're much better at knowing this stuff than I am. How much of Deutsche Telekom Germany's stuff is still Huawei?
Well, this is the big one, I suppose, is Germany, because what I wonder is there enough Huawei for them to eat into, if you like, in Europe to really make up for that China loss? And I'm not sure there is, because it's such a big market, and because it's 10 or 12%, 70,000 base stations, but maybe that many will get built again this year. There are not that many other countries where you're anywhere near that level, I don't think, per operator. And the one that's really quite sizable, obviously, if you look at European markets, where a lot of them are tiny little markets. Sweden's not a very big country, let's be honest. From Huawei's perspective, it's more the principle rather than the actual loss of business. Germany is big, obviously. It's a big country. Telefonica Deutschland last week was saying they've got about 30,000 sites. I think Deutsche Telekom's pushing towards substantially more than that, towards a sort of 40,000 level, I think, is sort of later ambitions as they roll out 5G. So these are big operators in a very, large geographical market, which is very urbanized. And Huawei's really, it's really dug in that market. It's got a massive role. It's still most of the DT network, I think. I think it's probably about 2/3 of Deutsche Telekom's networks, with the other third served by Ericsson. So there is an opportunity, but I don't, at the moment, the Germans have been quite resistant to that decision, the one that, we've seen taken in the UK, and the one that Sweden's made. They're very much sitting on the fence. And it's the same situation as Sweden, basically, except the Swedes have just sort of basically gone ahead and said, let's not worry too much about Ericsson. We're more bothered about getting Huawei out. Whereas the Germans have gone, hang on a minute. If we take a decision like that, then it really puts a lot of German industry at risk, because they ship so much to China, basically. Cars, machine tools, there's all sorts of,
That's the one that one immediately thinks of is Beamers going to China.
Yeah, and I think also there'd be more disruption. I mean, everybody talks about the disruption that gets caused when you have a swap out and how difficult it is to do. And I think in the UK, there was perhaps, one or two operators maybe exaggerating how bad it would be, quite early on in the 5G rollout.
They were making the most of it, weren't they?
And I think that with Deutsche Telekom, I do think that there's going to be, if it had to do that, it would be much worse for Deutsche Telekom than it would be for any of the UK operators, simply because they've moved so quickly. It's almost like they've done this to preempt things, if you like, so they can say, oh, if we had to take equipment out now, it would be massively costly and it would slow down the rollout of 5G services. And it would. They've got this 5G network. They now say, I think it's more than 50% of the German population it covers. I think at the end of last year was the target. And it's mainly Huawei, because Ericsson, I think, as far as I'm aware, most of Ericsson's work so far has been swapping out Nokia, basically. They came in instead of Nokia a few years ago, and they've really been sort of focused on upgrading the 4G systems to be sort of Ericsson ones. So I don't think Ericsson's been heavily involved in Deutsche Telekom's 5G rollout. So it's a lot of equipment that would have to go if that happened in Deutsche Telekom. And it'd be very disruptive, I think, for them.
The back to one point you made about how Ericsson's got some outstanding sort of litigation or something going on in China. The real danger, I think, these days of that sort of thing isn't just the litigation itself, but the thin end of the wedge it represents for politicians and regulators and opportunistic lawyers to then go, well, seeing as they did that, we should apply these other sanctions to them. I mean, this is a large part of what's been done to Huawei, especially in the US, It's like, right, we reckon we caught Huawei doing this one thing, therefore ban them from everything because they're dodgy. And that would be, if I was Börje Ekholm, that would be the thing I'd be most worried about, is if they get done for anything in China, then that gives the state all the pretext it needs to sort of ramp up the punitive measures.
Yeah,
if it was so inclined. So yes,
I mean, it's interesting in China. If you look through the earnings report, there's quite a lot of reference to what's going on in that market, and I some things that escaped my notice. I mean, I think you might have been aware of them, Scott. You've probably written about some of this, but I'd missed actually that there's new regulations that have gone into effect this month, I think, even that would allow authorities in China to reject or limit foreign investments, kind of like the entity list stuff that the US has done.
Yeah, I was vaguely aware of that. They've been tiptoeing around that for a little while.
It's almost but it's almost sort of like laying the groundwork for moves they could make against Ericsson, which is why you sense that they. Because I did ask him, have you been told? I asked Frederick, have you been told anything specifically by the Chinese government? And he did. He wouldn't comment on that. I mean,
no.
Said no basically.
Wasn't on the script.
But I didn't expect really to get a lot out of him on something like that. But you just sort of sense.
But you got to ask, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, you can see just from the lobbying efforts that have been made by Huawei and also the sort of how upset the Chinese government is about what Sweden's doing, and then introducing these kinds of rules and regulations where things are heading. So they're not stupid. They can see what the risks might be.
I think it's quite delicate, because I think China could be quite vindictive to US companies, although this is the nature of the interdependence of everything. I read a story, I think it was just an unsourced or anonymously sourced rumor about Apple increasingly moving its manufacture to sort of India and Vietnam and all that sort of thing. And that's the problem. China could just try and get cute and do something vindictive to Apple. But it's reliant on a lot of Apple money for the manufacture. So it's not really as simple as that. And then regarding doing something vindictive to Ericsson in order to punish Sweden, well, then it brings the whole EU into it. The EU has to adopt a position on that, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah.
So this is what we kind of count on now that we're in this post-Trump era, where things will sort of revert to a more behind-the-scenes, classically diplomatic jostling for position rather than the overtly confrontational approach of Trump. We've got the big cunning plan with China was always supposed to be, everyone knew they're a bit dodgy on human rights. Everyone knew they were undemocratic. Everyone knew that there were some sort of cultural differences. But they thought, look, this is the pro-globalization argument, appropriately enough, in the week of Davos and the WEF and the Great Reset and all that bullshit. Pro-globalization argument is, if we're also interdependent, this is also the EU argument. If we're also interdependent, we're never going to fight each other because it's too costly to do it.
Yeah.
And in fact, the argument that we're not going to fight each other as long as we're together seems to have been borne out, because as soon as we've left, they're starting to give us lip over vaccines and AstraZeneca and all that stuff.
Yeah.
I wonder what my critics in the forums would make of that, but there we go.
Of course, the downside is you end up having to deal with some fairly dubious regimes, don't you?
Well, that's it, isn't it? Interdependence works both ways.
Yeah, and this is a problem. And then all of a sudden those regimes of, they're not only doing things to their own people, which has been reported about for a while with the sort of stuff that's going on with the Uyghur Muslims in China, but all of a sudden being quite aggressive internationally, in terms of conflict with India and saber rattling in the South China Sea and all this. And that's definitely got a lot worse over the last couple of years, which is
when you get some pragmatic leaders or regimes where they'll go, okay, you want everyone to play nice and be part of some big global community. We'll be part of it, but we're going to work out a way of tipping the balance in our favour and taking the piss. It just happens. I'm sure everyone does it.
Yeah.
Listen, we've laboured that a fair bit, and we've got other stuff to chat about.
We've got a segue. We've got a segue.
That's what I was just going to bring up. So the other thing I asked Frederick about, and I think you mentioned, was Open RAN, because basically my view was, okay, you've had a great quarter. I'm not going to spend the brief time you've given to me congratulating you on having a great quarter. I'm going to ask you about some of the things that could that could fuck things up for you in the future.
Yeah.
One of them was China. Another one was Open RAN, which, obviously, as we've spoken about at great length on this, is a strategic threat to Ericsson because it threatens to bring other players into the RAN segment, which is where they get most of their cash. I asked him about that. Just looking at my notes here on my story. I mean, he gave me the same sort of thing as you saw in Boyer's one, how... no, that was different, sorry. I think the most interesting point he made, other than reiterating the view that they think an integrated RAN is still better, which it is currently, is he said, I think what's more important is that 5G gets deployed at all, and he's particularly worried about European competitiveness on that one.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know if you got any comment on that, but then the obvious segue is that your call with Rakuten concerned Open RAN as well. So feel free to respond to that and then move it on.
Well, I asked him the same question and pretty much got the same answer, and he elaborated a bit. But I did ask him what this is Frederick Yedling I'm talking about here, but I did ask him what he thought of this little EU sort of get together by four of the big operators, urging their governments to back Open RAN, and their message was clearly that. And I've noticed that Ericsson have felt this way anyway, because some of the top people at Ericsson have been retweeting something I wrote this week, suggesting, which is quite critical of the whole thing, suggesting that it'll be a better use of public sector funding, perhaps, if you are going to use public sector funding, to look at broader initiatives really and not be technology specific. So he came out and said that we don't believe in sort of technology neutral support for stuff, and it would be better for Europe to get behind 5G and not necessarily funding. I don't think he was saying, that Ericsson is obviously very frustrated.
It could be regulation.
I mean, that's the big thing. I think a lot of the Spectrum stuff, we talk about this a lot all the time on Spectrum. I think governments still, throughout the whole of the pandemic, still seem to think that Spectrum's a good opportunity to raise a buck or two, and it's far better to. And it is. Look, operators are very well off compared to a lot of other companies at the moment. They've done much better than hoteliers and airlines and all this sort of stuff. So maybe they seem like a good target for raising some cash. But then again, on the other hand, if you don't move ahead with these Spectrum auctions, then your 5G launch and rollout is going to be years behind everybody else. And then you miss out on a huge number of opportunities. So I'm very sympathetic towards this argument. I think it'd be far better to just...
Yeah, and it's short-term.
Maybe try and tax it in future, I don't know. But try and get this Spectrum into their hands so they can do something with it.
Just encourage infrastructure full stop. Because even if you just look at it from a tax revenue point of view, if the country's doing better, you're getting more goddamn tax revenue.
But to me, that's a far more sensible way that the EU or any national government could support operators and the sector, rather than by chipping a bit of money into Open RAN, which, to be quite honest with you, is a very specific thing and is something that the operators themselves could fund if they really wanted it and they really believed in it. We went on about this last week. So
so your point is that Ericsson's kind of echoing that.
And they basically went, so they basically sort of agreed with me, but I'm quite sympathetic towards their line there, really. And I'm not. That's not because I'm opposed to Open RAN per se. I just don't think it's something that should be supported in the way that Orange, Deutsche Telekom, Vodafone and Telefonica seem to think it should. You want to support it, guys. Get your own venture capital firms to put some money into Open RAN companies. Orange has just got 350 million euro fund they just started off. Why can't that do something?
Do you know what I mean? The taxpayers got enough shit to worry about right now.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and then immediately after that, when you and thank you for being on time, because you were immediately before me with Frederick, and my call started on time. So that's all good.
I don't think he was on a call before us. I think he was doing something else because he wasn't he wasn't with their press people. So
right,
he was late. Well, he was a bit late on mine, but he was only like 2 minutes late.
I had Jana on mine. But then the other incentive you had to be punctual was that you were having a call with Rakuten straight after. So why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, the Rakuten we talk about a lot there. So there's the segue with Open RAN because they're the big sort of cheerleader for Open RAN. They're the company that's deploying it nationwide in their national market of Japan,
and even licensing out their best practice.
Even licensing it out,
operators.
They basically control Altiostar, which is one of the big software vendors in the Open RAN industry. They're the majority owner in that now. So they're kind of a vendor as well in a way. So they've got a lot at stake. They want to see Open RAN be a big success, and they were obviously a bit miffed about something. I mean, this isn't even reading between the lines, just the way the round table discussion that I had went. They're obviously a bit miffed about something that Mike wrote, Mike Dana, my colleague in the US, where he picked up on some analyst reports that were coming out about deteriorating network quality in on the Rakuten network. Now, this has been one of the concerns, and this gets back to the comments we heard from Ekholm and Frederick Yedling and all the naysayers about Open RAN who go, yeah, it's all very well, but it just doesn't measure up. It's not capable of serving urban areas and demanding consumers. And that's a big deal in a market like Japan, which is very urbanized, obviously one of the most advanced mobile markets in the world. If it's not going to work there, then it's not going to work anywhere, is it, basically? So he basically got Tarek Amin, who's the CTO of Rakuten Mobile, the kind of telecom bit, got on the call and immediately took issue with this and said, well, they're not...
He didn't explicitly flag up light reading.
He didn't flag up light reading, but he said, I've been reading some of the reports, and he sort of said,
it's clear that's what he was...
That's clear what he said. And, and his gripe was that he was basically, I mean, the thing is, it'd be nice if he'd sort of addressed this head on, I think, months ago, perhaps, rather than allowing speculation to kind of continue about why network performance might be degrading, because it's the first time I've certainly ever heard it said, and I've been on most of their roundtables. But he said the real problem is not anything to do with Open RAN or the technology they're using. It's the fact that they've got this spectrum in the 1.7 gigahertz band that they're using for 4G. And for one thing, they've only got about a fifth as much spectrum as any of their rivals. So they're very, very constrained. And the other issue, apparently, is that even with what they've been allocated, they can't use most of it at the moment because it's still being used by the Japanese military. So they're working at the moment to try and get the military off.
I didn't know there was such a thing.
Ministry of Defence.
Right, they're allowed to have guns again, are they?
Well, this is in Japan. I mean, it's
because Japan and Germany after the Second World War weren't allowed to have any armed forces, were they?
Yeah, it's basically used by the Ministry of Defence anyway for communications, and it's
keeping an eye on China or whatever.
And what it means is that the 20 megahertz they've only actually got about 5 megahertz across a huge chunk of Japan, like a lot of the country, and clearly that's going to affect network performance. So what Open Signal, which is one of the analysts that Mike had sort of had reported on, what they were saying was that when they looked at network performance in May and then compared it again in September, Rakuten's the megabits per second download speed that you get had gone down as users were joining the network, which is what happens. If you get more users in a cell site and you've got spectrum constraints, then performance is going to go down. And and it's noticeable as well that if you look at the other Japanese operators, they're much, much better on that particular measure. They all have much faster networks on download speeds and don't seem to have had this deterioration issue. So this was kind of the purpose of the call, really. It was to try and address some of the concern about Open RAN, because, obviously if this argument that it is not, that it's not ready for prime time and that it's only something you can really use in rural areas and we have to wait several years before it reaches maturity and parity, I guess, with traditional it's not a message that Rakuten's particularly keen on.
So how well do you think he addressed that concern?
Well, he did address it well, and he's a really competent, capable guy. Obviously, he's very smart.
A guru,
and I'm always impressed by him. I mean, two things I would say is, first, as I say, I just think maybe they should have called it out sooner. I think when they were deploying, they should perhaps have said, by the way, we've got some spectrum constraints and it's going to be a while before this is resolved. Now, what he's saying at the moment is it's going to take the rest of this year before they've fully cleared that and they're on this full to the 20 megahertz. So that's the first thing I would say is that perhaps they should just have, highlighted this immediately. And then when these analysts go off and make their reports, they can take that into account, Because it seemed like people are writing from a position where they didn't really know about this. It seemed to be news to people. The other thing I would say is, does the consumer really care? This is the issue. I mean, all right, maybe it isn't Open RAN.
It's shit.
Maybe it isn't Open RAN's fault. I still don't think this is going to put to sleep all the kind of conjecture about Open RAN. A lot of operators will still say to you that it's not as good at the moment. So, and just because Rakuten is insisting, I don't think he's going to sway the whole industry. And they obviously need a network that's performing really well to be able to fully convince people. So it's not going to help them anyway. It doesn't prove, does it, that Open RAN is kind of up to scratch. It just means there might be another problem.
And I think there's an interesting moral there in terms of messaging, and this is relevant to the final segment as well. In this case, sort of getting ahead of the message. So we're in a world now where public messaging is quite complicated. It used to be quite straightforward. There'd be a few channels to the public, i.e. the media, and you'd issue press releases, and you'd actually have proactive PR operations where people would like chat to us and take us out for lunch and explain shit at length. But now most companies seem more worried about sort of social media and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
which is a lot harder to control. But what they can do is just be a bit more proactive, just in whatever messaging they do to the traditional media. So, for example, OpenSignal had and for that matter, Mike at Light Reading had a more comprehensive briefing on the precise factors affecting Rakuten's network performance, including spectrum, then that would, I presume, would have at least been included as some nuance in the reporting of the shitty numbers that OpenSignal were getting for them. So I think they just failed to get ahead of the game.
Yeah, they failed to get ahead of the game, and maybe they just thought it wasn't. I mean, the trouble, if we disregard all the stuff about Open RAN, the problem is that this isn't all about Open RAN. They're trying to build a position in the Japanese market. They're trying to get customers on board. They're not just trying to advertise Open RAN. And a customer won't care about Open RAN. They just care about good network performance. So whether it's spectrum or whether it's the technology, it's still an issue for them, I think. It's still a bit of a problem that they've got this constraint that isn't going to be fully resolved until the end of the year. I mean, the good news is, and this is where perhaps we will be able to make a proper assessment about the capabilities of Open RAN, and Tareq Amin will finally be proved right that all these naysayers are completely wrong and they're all overly negative, is that on 5G, apparently they've got loads of spectrum. It's only a 4G constraint. They've got loads and loads they can use. They're very well off in terms of 5G frequencies. So
probably mid-band.
That's a younger service. It was launched more recently. I think they've got some of the mid-band stuff, but I think they've also got some sort of millimeter wave spectrum resources they can use. So it really is quite
good that is.
Well, yeah, I know it's not something you're going to deploy across a macro network, and they said that themselves. Credit to them, but I think across the various bands that you would think of using for 5G, they're quite well off. So it's not an excuse they can use. Basically, this one about spectrum, and therefore,
so if they're still shite, then
if it's still rubbish, then yeah,
but it was a really dodgy day, and I've had a bit of a bug, and and look, just get off my fucking back.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in terms of their comms with the press, I mean, in fairness to them, I do think they're in Japan for a start, so they're not somebody I expect to be taking me out for drinks and dinners anyway, even if we were able to do that in the UK at the moment very much. And they are pretty proactive, I think, I have to say, on the...
No, fair enough. That
was more... They're much better, I think, than most other operators at the moment, I would say, to be honest.
Credit where it's due. Yeah, that's
and it's nice that they got on top of this quite quickly. That's the other thing. They saw the reports going out and responded pretty fast to it.
That's good, but even better than that would be to have not had to have a sudden flap and a panic. I mean, I think, did you tell me that through the channels it would be made clear to you that it would be particularly appreciated if you were on the call?
It did, yes.
So that's firefighting. Ideally, ideally you want to not be firefighting. And this is part of a general gripe I've got about corporate spend on marketing and PR. Because I can completely imagine that they've lost control of the story because they've got hardly any people internally whose job it is day to day to stay on top of these things. I mean, in-house PR departments are just a fraction of the size of what they were even a decade ago, aren't they?
They are, yeah.
And the thing about having an in-house PR person is it's their job, even if they're not very good, it's their job to just obsess about this stuff the whole time. You can't expect Tareq Amin to be obsessing about this. He's too busy being elbows deep in circuit boards and thinking about cleverness.
And he's far more accessible actually as a CTO, and probably the most sought after CTO in the industry, I think, at the moment. You know, he's extremely high profile. I mean, I saw the Telegraph's even writing about Rakuten at the moment quite recently.
Right. Yes. So all they need to do is drop a bit of cash on some in-house PR.
Yeah.
And then they don't have to suddenly get this bloke away from his sort of dungeon lab.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they just need more PR people. They've got a few who are very good, but maybe they just need more.
No, believe me,
more
I mean, I don't have any contact with them PR wise, so it's certainly not a dig at their PR specifically.
Yeah, no, they're impressive on all that on that front, and it was good that they got this call together quite fast.
Yeah.
I mean, I should say that it came off the back. It wasn't. This is why I don't want to over-egg this sort of, it was a response to something like Reading wrote kind of thing, because they did have an announcement. They did have an announcement today, and they usually do a roundtable after they've had those announcements. They usually do a technology roundtable. So what they announced was, and I'm unfamiliar with all the details at the moment because a freelancer covered this and somebody else edited it, but they basically overhauled some of their tariffs. And cut prices even more than they already, they already had these knockdown rates, which I think were about 50% as much as other Japanese operators were charging. They're now, I think there's services you can get if you're only using a few megabytes a month or a couple of gigabytes a month, you're paying almost nothing. Now, there's a bit of desperation here, though, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe that's acknowledgement of their network being a bit shy.
They've not had, This is where there are question marks about what they're trying to do. Is that they came on the scene with these bold plans to build a fourth network, and hired Tara Commun, who'd previously been at Jio in India, which has been a massive success story. It's gone from being a new entrant to the biggest operator in that market with millions and millions of customers. And I think there was a sort of expectation that maybe they could pull off the same thing in Japan.
Do a Jio.
And it's totally different circumstances. And then a lot of analysts were skeptical, saying, hang on, people aren't as price sensitive. It's tough because it's a very advanced market. You're using unproven technologies. And some of these questions they've still, despite this sort of spectrum, blaming the spectrum and not the network for what's going on, they still really haven't, I don't think, addressed that issue. And the subscriber numbers are not that encouraging. This is the problem. They're still on about, I think it's 2.2 million they're on customer numbers at the moment, about 10 months after launching, which is, they would have hoped for more than that. I mean, they'll play that down and say, yeah, okay, it's slow going, and we never expected it to be the kind of big bang that we had, that Jio had in India. But you can tell they would have wanted to have done better than that, I think. And it's it's just interesting that they've not, they haven't really proven the case yet, I don't think. And I think the other challenge they've got, and I did ask about this on the call. Japan's other operators are responding now. This is the thing. They're starting to, I think, offer more competitive rates. I think there's been some government insistence, actually, that tariffs come down because they're perceived to be quite expensive in Japan, which doesn't really help Rakuten when you've got authorities saying to the other operators, you need to lower prices. If that's one of their big advantages, and everybody's moving in that direction. And they're also making use of similar technologies. So Open RAN, I think we've now got NTT Docomo, haven't we? I'm not sure about the other operators, but certainly Docomo's made some steps, taken some steps in this direction.
Right.
And I said to him,
that's how a free market should work.
That's how but the question is
competitive pressure.
If other companies adopt some of the technologies that Rakuten says have given it such a big advantage, then does it erode Rakuten's advantage? That's the issue.
Yeah.
How does it maintain it? And he played this down on the call. He said, well, look, they're legacy players. I mean, he very much played up we're a greenfield operator. We've got people that are trained and skilled to work with software and to work with automation tools in a way that the big carriers don't. And maybe that's fair enough, but it's still it's a real challenge for them, I think, and it's going to be a while before we can really sort of assess how well they've done. And
which
credit
explains
to
why
them.
they might be. Which explains why they might be feeling a bit defensive at the moment, and some of that cost.
Possibly, yeah.
No, I'm sure it wasn't entirely down to your coverage, but I mean, you will, Light Reading, dare I say it, certainly on the more technical stuff, more than telecoms.com will be one of the sites where they're like, okay, if Light Reading's writing about this, then it's a thing.
Yeah.
So fair enough. Okay, look, let's move it on. So this week, we had some crazy stuff going on. I'll just take it from the top. And Pierre, I know you're very interested in this, so do feel free to butt in every time if you fancy it. We basically had the situation of a company called GameStop, which is a computer games retailer in the US. As you can imagine, a computer games retailer, you expect to be in a state of slow decline as a lot of other retailers, as opposed to e-tail, Amazon type stuff. And a few hedge funds decided to take a short position on them. And a short selling, in a nutshell, is when you borrow the shares in a given company from a broker and immediately sell them. So let's say you borrow them at a tenner and you immediately sell them at a tenner. And what you're hoping is that when you give them back to the broker, let's say in a week, they've gone down to £8, and you keep the 20% difference when you give them back to the broker. So you have to buy them back again, but you buy them back at £8, and they go, there you go, broker, thanks a lot for that. And then you trouser the difference. The really fun thing about short selling is the risk is limitless. So if you're doing normal share buying, you buy a share for a tenner, company goes bankrupt, you lose a tenner. But if you're short selling the company and the price keeps going up, there's no limit to the amount you have to pay to buy that share back when you have to give it back to the broker you borrowed it from. So you could buy it for a tenner, it goes to £100. You've lost £90. You've lost 9 times your original stake. That's what happened with GameStop. Some people on Reddit saw that these hedge funds were shorting GameStop, and they went, fuck it, let's buy loads of GameStop and drive the price up and punish these Wall Street companies for shorting, which they did so successfully. And one, the best known of the companies that had a short position, called Melvin Capital, I think had to exit with about a $3.75 billion loss just on this one bet. Now, this is by far our most read story of the week, and as you will have noticed, there is not a telecoms angle so far. Nokia gave me a telecoms angle by issuing a statement saying, because Nokia is one of the shares that was rumored to be also shorted and thus also possibly subject to these weird market manipulation and speculative craziness. And they issued a statement going, look, we don't know what's going on. We haven't said anything. It's all just gone a bit mental. And so that gave me the pretext to write about it, and my story got tons of reads, so that's all good. But but there are at least a couple of interesting narratives I think this yields. Not so much the narrative about the mechanics of money, of equity markets, although that's interesting. A lot of people have suddenly become expert on short selling, having known fuck all about it a week ago. Whereas I've always found this interesting, a la the Big Short and the financial crisis of 2008 and all that sort of thing. It's more a cultural thing, because I copied and pasted a comment from one of the participants in this Reddit group, which is called Wall Street Bets. It's called a subreddit. That's what they call their groups on Reddit. Who's basically saying that this is a big FU. Why am I suddenly not saying fuck? I don't know. Suddenly felt the need to censor myself there. A big fuck you to Wall Street for the financial crisis of 2008. In other words, this is our way of getting back at these hedge funds and these alleged market manipulators and all that sort of thing. So that was really interesting. And then the other part of it we touched on when we were talking about Rakuten earlier is the market messaging, because there's one more little sub-story from this, which is there's an app called Robinhood, which is like a retail equity investment app. So I currently do some retail equity investing using a app called Freetrade. And Robinhood, I think, is quite equivalent to Freetrade. So I just buy like a tenner here, a tenner there. I have literally a tenner's worth of Nokia stock, full disclosure. And I think I've got 20 quid's worth of Ericsson stock. Obviously, I'm not buying that amount of stock because I think it's going to make me life-changing amounts of money. With them, I partly bought it just to keep an eye on them, just because I'm curious. And I've done it with one or two operators like Vodafone and BT as well.
Who'd you buy it through?
Freetrade.
Freetrade.
Yeah, so it's a simple app. You can just get on there, and it just lets you commission-free just buy stocks. My biggest position, incidentally, is I have Aston Martin, Apache, which is an oil company, and Greggs, which makes sausage rolls. So, in case anyone's wondering whether my very
delicious sausage rolls,
yes, delicious sausage. In case anyone's wondering whether my very entry-level stock speculation might create any conflicts of interest for me in my telecoms reporting, I really don't. I have minimal positions in anything telecomsy. But anyway, so Robinhood, basically, this is like I think just yesterday. Is that right, Pierre?
The what?
When Robinhood basically
Yes.
pulled the plug on it. So yesterday, Robinhood pulled the plug on any trading in GameStop and one or two of the
other ones as well.
Yeah, and one or two other ones, including Nokia and AMC, which is another one that was getting heavily shorted. And everyone completely freaked out because they figured, okay, so what's happening here is that when hedge funds start manipulating markets, no one's got anything to say and they just let them do it. But as soon as some amateurs get involved and start collaborating via Reddit and social media to drive up price, then suddenly all the powers that be pull the plug. Now, I think there's an interesting thing here because I was reading about this morning and I'm really tempted by that narrative. I'm very much, let's do what we can to fight back against the man and the establishment and stick up for the little guy and all that sort of thing. So I was very receptive to this narrative. But reading around it, I think it's possible that Robinhood may have been forced to make that move just because of the way money markets work. Basically, when you get really abnormal movements, most money markets are just operating on a shoestring, as was evidenced in the financial crisis. And as soon as things get weird, they don't have any capital reserves to bail themselves out. So they have to call upon governments and all that sort of thing. That's why we've had these regulations since 2008, which make the big banks hold on to massive reserves of cash so that if there's a sudden liquidity crisis, they don't need bailing out by the state. And so I think that might have been one factor in why Robinhood had to suddenly stop its customers from trading in this share. But then on the flip side, it only stopped them.
Sorry.
Yeah, go on, Pierre.
No, I mean, I think the most probable reason is because the orders from Robinhood are fulfilled by a company called Citadel.
Well,
massive company, and Citadel bailed out Melvin Capital.
So there's a real weird interdependence there.
And Citadel themselves probably were short on GameStop, so they probably forced Robinhood to do this.
Yes, and that's quite possible, and that narrative is just as plausible. All I'm saying is, in the name of balance, I can see why there would be some reasons beyond just helping their mates out why Robinhood might have had to do what it did. But then that begs the question: all Robinhood did was it stopped its users from buying GameStop and others.
Yeah.
It didn't stop them from selling it. And the natural consequence of setting up a restriction just on buying but not selling will be to drive the price of that stock down. Thus, whether on purpose or incidentally, also assisting all these hedge funds who have got these precarious short positions. So
it does look like the hedge funds. It looks like the hedge funds were taking a breather there. They were like, we're gasping for air. We need to take a whole breath. And this was their window, which was yesterday. Now it's kind of weird that they're allowing it back, which means maybe today they're finally positioned accordingly. Let's say and they go, okay, now you can do whatever you want. Where we've hedged our bets, basically. It seems
yes, well, as they do.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, but you look at those apps like Robinhood and Webull and in the UK, trading
free
212, I think.
Yeah, free trade and all that.
I'm sure these guys, all these apps are like small players in this enormous industry, and they're kind of like tolerated, I'm guessing. So they kind of do whatever they're told. I'm assuming.
Well, maybe, but
I'm not a fan.
Sorry,
I'm not an expert, but it's just, I don't know. From all these things, it seems this is the picture I'm getting, that they're sort of the little players.
I think they are, but that's kind of the point of this whole story is it's the little players, isn't it? And little players using apps like that. So they've gone from little players, and maybe you're right. They just thought, oh, bless them, let retail investors chuck a few $100 here and there. But it turns out via this subreddit, that these little pissy retail investors can move markets just as profoundly as the big boys when they put their mind to it.
I know, and you know what? I'm gonna play devil's advocate here, and people are saying, if you criticize the Reddit forum, that means you're with Wall Street, which I don't think it's
Typical
it's true. I
binary
think
stuff,
both,
isn't it?
Yeah, I think both things are true. I mean, let's call it what this is. It's a game. This is another of my analogies. I love those or metaphors. It's a game of musical chairs, and let's say there were 6 guys at the beginning playing, and there were 5 chairs, and they were playing musical chairs. This was the forum, the size of the forum at the beginning, and it was fair. But they started playing musical chairs in the big field outside, and people started walking by and being, "Oh, what are you guys doing?"
Yeah.
"Oh, we're playing musical chairs." And
I'll have a go at
those
that.
people had no idea. They had no idea what musical chairs were. They were told, "This is how you play. You basically walk around the chair. That's all you need to do. That's the entire game." And they're like, "Great, let's do this." This is all these posts on Reddit that you see. Hold the line, hold the line. They're telling people just walk around the chairs, and then there's 1,000 people for those 5 chairs.
Yeah.
And the 6 original guys are still walking really near the chairs, waiting for the music to stop. And then the other people are miles away. And, of course it's about making money. I mean, I'm sure a few of them are like, "No, let's actually stick it to the men." Fine, but what are you doing? Are you really putting 10 grand in and ready to lose it all just to stick it to the men? No, you're also looking at the thing going up, and you're going to cash in. You are going to cash in.
And it's quite possible that
a lot of people will get hurt.
But plenty of the members of this Reddit forum were actually city boys in disguise anyway.
Not even that. I'm sure there were maybe even amateurs. But guess what? If you got in, last year, it's not fair for you to come in and show all your gains, because it's not fair. People who are getting in now, there's a huge,
well, you'd be mad to buy GameStop
position.
now, wouldn't you?
I wouldn't touch it with.
No.
Let's keep it
so,
PG.
So Ian, does that sort of assessment of it make any sense to you? I mean, I don't know if you already understood what short selling was and all that.
I knew what short selling was. Yeah. I mean, whenever it comes up, I usually have to go and read a brief. It's one of those things you sort of forget how it exactly works, because it's the borrowing process that always confuses me slightly. The fact that you actually borrow the share from somebody else and pay them.
It's like renting.
Yeah, it's like renting a share. So you try and explain it to someone,
because you pay a fee.
They're like, "Well, hang on a minute. If they got the share and they bought it, how do they make money when the price falls?" So, but it's a weird one. I think it's. I don't know. Some of these constructs that they have in trading are quite odd.
Derivatives.
I think, and the whole notion of short selling itself, I think it's been quite controversial, hasn't it, over the years, because it was sort of heavily implicated in the whole 2008 crash. There were people coming out at the time saying, I think, that short selling shouldn't really be allowed, and they're all just they're the worst type of Wall Street people, aren't they? Short sellers, they're basically just there to make money, and they're not there to invest.
A lot of the objection is the vested interest. When you're betting on something declining, you have an interest in trying to make sure that outcome happens.
Yeah.
So then,
I think in the 2008 crisis, there was a proof that those mortgages were crap. It was going to collapse at some point. It just accelerated the whole process, I think.
Yeah. And it's timing, isn't
it? It's not
like...
Yeah. I think, there were tons of mortgages given to people who would never repay them. That's like a fact,
Yes.
I think.
Well, and the greater than 100% mortgages, for example.
Yeah.
So I like the story about
by the way...
Sorry, Pierre, go on.
No, I was just going to say, this whole thing has been great at educating so many people on this. I'm sure like the Google searches on like stock options and shorting, they must be through the roof.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say, really. I think it's bringing this sort of stuff to wider attention, and trading and buying stocks and shares is something I think a lot of people still don't really do. They put money in, you can't really find high interest savings accounts these days, but they try and find other ways of being reasonably safe with money, and they're not prepared to sort of dabble in some of this stuff. And maybe if it brings it to wider attention, that's good. I mean, the story about little men losing out and it pitting them against the city, and all of a sudden these Wall Street guys are taking umbrage. I really like that. I just wonder whether these sort of day traders and these amateurs are really are they the kind of they're not working class heroes, are they? I mean, some of them are aspiring traders themselves, I think. Or, I'd like it to be a story of the little man against the big institution. And I wonder if it is quite narrative. As much as it is. That's the
well,
issue
as ever,
me, suppose,
there'll be nuances in there. One thing I wanted to touch on with Robin Hood. So Robin Hood got an absolute kicking on social media. This has been one of the rare occasions where the narrative seemed to be so simple that it's completely, Americans will call it bipartisan. So you've had people at the far left of the Democrat Party, people at the far right of the Republican Party getting together and all agreeing that hedge funds are wankers.
Maybe this will bring some kind of unity that wasn't there before. Maybe that's what this will do.
Well, briefly, as we saw with the start.
It really is doing that.
Yeah.
Honestly, I really feel like this is, the post of AOC and Donald Trump Jr., that's incredible.
Yeah.
That's really incredible.
Proper Romeo and Juliet stuff there. But I think, back to the messaging thing, I think Robin Hood kind of dropped the ball, because Robin Hood went, right, we're banning our users from selling this stuff. And so they easily laid the ground for the narrative that they're in collusion with Melbourne Capital and that other one Pierre mentioned, whose name escapes me, begins with C, and the rest of Wall Street. But I do think there probably were some mechanical reasons behind how money markets and equity markets work, and liquidity and all that sort of thing, that meant they did have to do something. So I think they kind of botched the messaging. And I think, he subsequently, the Robin Hood guy, who doesn't help himself by having a Russian name as well, sort of came out and explained in greater detail, no, it's because of this, it's because of this. But the story, the narrative had already been formed by that stage. Because Robin Hood, as the name implies, they position themselves as being for the little guy.
Yeah.
That's the whole fucking point of their branding, as far as I understand it. And so when Robin Hood, of all things, then suddenly decides to get cozy with the Sheriff of Nottingham, it makes for such a clear narrative that everyone jumped on it. And I just think they dropped the ball there.
You couldn't write it.
You what?
Yeah. This is going to be made. You couldn't write this. This is going to be made into a movie in a few years.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I hope Michael Lewis gets on it. He did such a good job with the financial crisis. And people like Matt Taibbi will presumably do a great job as well.
Adam McKay will direct the movie.
Yeah. So that's that really. There's the only other thing I want to talk about, because I think we've done an hour already, is the little guy versus the man narrative. Also, one person got in touch with me on LinkedIn to say they enjoyed my article, and they said it reminded them of the AWS thing versus Parler. In so much as it's another example of the people who really run things, who own the platforms, who own the technology, who have the connections, basically shifting the goalposts as soon as the little guy starts to piss them off. And I was reminded of another story I wrote earlier on this week, where I think Twitter. So Twitter's constantly trying to work out how it can censor people without getting called a censor. And it's going to try this community policing, where it's going to let people grass each other up. And of course, that's going to be so subject to abuse. It's ridiculous. So I think the broader point I'm trying to make is that we're in the Wild West, with whether it's social media, whether it's trading, and all of this has been enabled by the internet. The internet is Pandora's box. It's already open. And now we keep seeing examples of people trying to get all the contents of Pandora's box back in. But I think it's too late. And I think we're just going to see lots more examples of this kind of chaos. And initially, I'll always buy into the narrative, and everyone loves the narrative. But I think we can all agree it's probably a little bit more complicated than, ironically, the Robin Hood situation that we like to view it as. Cool. All right, I'll take that pause as no one else having anything to add. So yes, enjoy your Guinness. Are you going to go down to Sainsbury's or whatever and stock up now?
Now that I've started drinking, I'm thinking might be nice to have a couple this evening as well.
I can't. Yeah. You see, you and I, we've both been out to the pub many times. When we're in the pub, we have very similar drinking habits, but where we differ is the amount of alcoholic reserves we keep in the house.
I shall be making up for this in February. Don't believe me. I mean, I'm not. February is not going to be an alcohol-free month by any stretch.
It's just if I was coming to the end of Dry January, there would be crates of the stuff waiting for that moment.
Well, there might be this weekend.
Cool. All right then. Well, enjoy your weekend, Ian. Look forward to seeing you on Monday morning. See what kind of a state you're in. With your family having disowned you or made you live in the shed or something. All right, guys. Cheers for that, and thanks to everyone for listening. And make sure you join us for the next one.